Welcome back everyone to the weekly Mailbox, episode 41, and if you don't know the drill by now, this is your chance to ask me questions about anything you would like. Formula 1, Formula E, motorsport, anything in between. 5 questions, as always, asked by you, whether that's in the YouTube comments, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff. So if you want to ask me a question for next week's, those are the places to do so. But we're going to start this week with a question from YouTube coming from Lorenzo Letta, who asks, is this going to be Magnussen's last season in Formula 1? And I'm going to spin this a little bit as well, because I think Kevin Magnussen is one of those drivers that definitely goes under the radar in Formula 1. He's one of those drivers that we're all aware he's on the grid, but I think sometimes he's undercredited for some awesome drives, especially in qualifying, but he's also one of those drivers who doesn't necessarily do massive standout performances, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think is where I often find myself with Kevin Magnussen, and there's no denying, in 2018, he was certainly the team leader at Haas, something that Grosjean had been since the team's conception in the end of 2015 into 2016. Grosjean was their man. 2017, Magnussen's first year, wasn't great. His year at Renault wasn't great. His year at McLaren wasn't fantastic. But that year in 2018, he really evolved and developed. And I finally felt, you know what, this Magnussen, who I think we're all aware is one of the more aggressive drivers on the grid, he would be near the top of my list for that for sure, and a hard racer, and sometimes blurs the lines between what's fair and what's a little bit too far. But I think that's why people love him so much, is that he is a bit more of a fiery character, and that's something I always say, is that we love to see different characters in Formula 1, and if they all played by the rulebook, all stayed within the lines, and it just wouldn't be the same. It just wouldn't have that flavour that we love about Formula 1. So 2018 was great for Kevin Magnussen. 2019, it was a bit meh. And I always struggle to place either of the Haas drivers, Grosjean or Magnussen, because reliability in that car was abysmal. Grosjean had 7 DNFs. 5 of those were reliability issues. Magnussen had a similar issue over the season and was lucky he scored in the first race of the season. 5th place, 10 points, and even in that race, Grosjean's tyres fell off. So, as a team, Haas definitely didn't quite play their cards right last season, and I think to judge Magnussen on last year would be quite harsh. Do I think this is going to be his last season in Formula 1? Well, again, he's had 3 seasons at Haas, and I would say over his Formula 1 career, there's only been 1 season I've been super impressed with, but I don't think the others have been awful, and he's one of those drivers that wouldn't massively surprise me if the transfer saga went all crazy at the end of this year and he lost out on a seat. But I also think, whereas that year at McLaren, I could see why they bought in Alonso, whereas with Renault, I could see why they bought in Hulkenberg, I think I'd be a little bit disappointed for Kevin Magnussen if he was the one who lost out on the Haas seat instead of Grosjean. And for those of you that have followed the channel for a while, you will know that's a little bit surprising for me to say that. But I think over the last couple of years, although Grosjean, it's come from the team that he's much better at setting up the car, giving feedback, and is a big reason why the team has felt they've managed to solve a lot of their 2019 issues because of Grosjean's feedback and going back to that original spec car in 2019. I think overall, Magnussen is it's quite a bit younger actually than Grosjean, isn't he? About 5 or 6 years, I think the gap is. So he's got that on his side, and I think he's a little bit more consistent. Again, does have that fiery edge, and is definitely a headache for the team sometimes. I mean, slamming Gunther Steiner's door is definitely a no-no. If you've seen Drive to Survive, you'll know exactly what I'm on about. But is this his last season in Formula 1? I don't think so. I think that would be very harsh for the team to do so. And considering it's very likely the team will stay for 21 because the chassis is going to remain the same, I think most teams actually for next year are going to retain the exact same lineup. So for 2022, I think there's a few more questions with the likes of, I think, Kvyat and Gasly maybe potentially being without a drive, and then maybe Haas will think about maybe changing both their drivers. But no, I think K-Mag's at least got a couple more seasons, which I'm certainly very happy about. Thank you for your question. Moving on to question 2, which comes from Conan MM93 LH44. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, LH44, that's Lewis Hamilton. I know that one. I'm not that much of a dummy, but MM93, I had a bit of a quick think about that. Marc Marquez? MotoGP? I'm not a big MotoGP guy. Anyway, that's not the question. I just thought I'd share that with you. What are your thoughts on the... Sorry, guys. What are your thoughts on the possibility of Panthera Team Asia joining Formula One when the new regulations are implemented? I think I did a question a few months ago. May have even been during the actual... It must have been during the actual winter break. It was quite a while ago. And I think we actually focused more on, I think it was Campos at the time, looking to join Formula One. And it was heavily rumoured that Pascal Wehrlein would be one of their drivers. But Panthera, I'm not too sure if I say that right, but Panthera is how I'm going to go with it. And really sorry if that bugs you for the rest of this question. I'm all for having new teams on the grid. And actually, all of our teams, including Haas, their main base is in Europe. I think all of the teams are either based in the UK or in Italy. And again, I mean, Haas are under American racing license, Red Bull, Austrian. There's slight nuances and variances like that. But for the most part, it's their actual headquarters are either in Britain or Italy. And I think if we had an Asian team, that would just bring a bit more extra flavour. I think having an American team in Haas has been a great addition to Formula One. And I think we're going to Vietnam. We have great circuits in Japan and Singapore. China's a bit meh, but I like the fact Formula One's expanding into different regions, into different markets over the world. And I think the next step for Asian motor racing would be, I think we're missing, I suppose we've got Alex Albon is the most predominant Asian racer technically in Formula One. Though he was born in Britain, he's under a Thai licence. So certainly, I think that market for Formula One is growing, and I think a team would be very nice. I definitely think Formula One needs a couple more teams, not too many. I think 2010 when we had Caterham, Marussia and HRT, or Lotus, Virgin and HRT, whichever names you want to give all of them, when we had those three teams at the back, although it wasn't a lot, we didn't see them on track a lot, it was nice just to know they were there. It's another obstacle, another blue flag for the cars to get out the way of. It's another story in qualifying. And you think of moments like Bianchi getting those points for Manor or Marussia. I think they were Manor Marussia, which makes it even more awkward. But when he scored in Monaco 2014, when Kovalainen almost scored for Lotus in 2011, I want to say, in Monaco again, it's just little things to keep your eye on. And it also gives drivers, like Bianchi, like Ricciardo. He drove for HRT, Daniel Ricciardo. Gives them an opportunity to get on the grid. Look at Formula 2 this year. Whoever wins that championship, it's going to be super difficult to get them into a Formula 1 drive. I would argue unless you're in the Ferrari Junior Academy, where it looks like Kimi Raikkonen might retire at Alfa Romeo, and then maybe a Ferrari Junior could get themselves in that seat. But apart from that, if a Guan Yu Zhou, a Renault young driver, if Jack Aitken, Williams, maybe Jack Aitken potentially, if Williams are willing to give up a seat. But you can already see what I mean. It's going to be difficult for a lot of young drivers to get a seat in Formula One. Whereas if we had more of these smaller teams at the back, okay, I don't think Panthera would jump into F1 and be a title-winning team. Although Haas proved us wrong in that sense that in their first two races, they got a 5th and 6th in the hands of Grosjean in Australia and Bahrain in 2016. So never say never, but I definitely am one of those motorsports fans that would love to see a couple more teams on the grid. And actually, Panthera, if we're losing the Pink Panthers in Racing Point, could be a fun one to jump on the grid. And again, definitely, I think we're missing that Asian team on the grid at the moment. But I'd love to know your thoughts on that one. It's a bit more of a unique question, but definitely, if it's not Panthera, any team I will definitely take. Question number 3. Now, I've done 2 questions for question number 3, but you'll see why very quickly. So it's from Ty Poundsign, who does some of the open lobbies with me and is stewarded also for a couple of those on Twitch. So thank you, dude. I thought I'll include your question, but I also saw Zorro Bell's question, and I thought I could do a kind of mishmash hybrid mess of a question. So Ty Poundsign asks, how well will Aston Martin fare after the 2022 regulations come into play? Zorro Bell then asks, which teams are in the best position to make big gains from the 2022 rule changes? So we'll start off with Aston Martin, and it's a real difficult one, I find, with Aston Martin, because first of all, it's awesome that they're finally getting onto the grid as a fully fleshed out team. Not Aston Martin Red Bull Racing, just Aston Martin. And again, there might be a title sponsor, but to have that name on the grid will be awesome. Another sports car brand on... Oh, very happy about that indeed. And again, I hope they go for British Racing Green, but even a nice burgundy, that would also be very nice indeed. What do I think about 2022? Well, I like the fact that their 2020 car, this is Racing Point, who are going to evolve into Aston Martin, I really like the fact they've copied Mercedes. Now, a lot of you are going to go, oh my goodness me, what has he just said? But if you just bear with me, I like it because it allows them, because they're a team that are on a very small budget. Yes, that's changed since Stroll has come in, but historically they've been a team that have massively punched above their weight with not a lot of money. And by copying Mercedes' car, they're going to dramatically cut R&D costs. They also pretty much know it's going to be a solid car on track. So what they can do, and this potentially could hurt them because we're now going to have 2 seasons of this same chassis, but what that allows them to do is know they've got a good car and very early on focus on development for 2022, the brand new regulations. And I think that's very, very clever. From a racing purist, it's a little bit snaky, a little bit dodgy, and that's the side of it I really don't like. And I think a lot of you would agree with that. But from a business perspective, that is some real big brains someone has had at that team and puts them, I think, in quite a good position for 2022. My issue, I think, a little bit with Aston Martin is their driver lineup. And I look at teams, because, 2022, I would be very surprised if Mercedes, Ferrari or Red Bull drop further back. And I'm more looking at teams in the midfield catching up and fighting some of the big dogs. And I certainly think Renault and McLaren have the resources, especially with McLaren going to Mercedes engines, but the resources and a very competitive driver lineup pairing at both of those teams. Racing Point, I think, have the resources to build a good car. They've got a great brand, a great collective of people behind them. Perez, I think, is a driver who deserves a chance at the top. And by the time we get to 2022, it's going to be coming to the end of his time in Formula One, and having a chance with Aston Martin will be a nice round off to his career, actually, and building that team up like he's been able to stabilise the Force India and Racing Point ship. But I think you can see where I'm going with this. Lance Stroll, whilst I don't think he's as bad as people say, I think certainly he deserves more credit for his opening laps, his ability to make tyres last long. You can't be having those huge issues in qualifying if a team like Aston Martin are wanting to push for multiple podiums, wanting to push for championships. And that's a little bit where I come stuck with Aston Martin. And I've kind of answered Zorro Bell's question in my answer, which is why I wanted to include it. Because I do think Renault and McLaren have the capability to make big gains. And I think Aston Martin will join them in that pack. And I think a little bit like 2012, we may even see the likes of Alfa Romeo and Haas on their day being able to beat certain teams, maybe like a Mercedes. Maybe like in 2012, we'll see certain circuits really suit Mercedes. They won in China, but that was it. That was their only circuit all year long where they did really well at. So for Aston Martin, it may be a case if they really want to push on, they're going to have to make some changes. Whether that's going to happen with Stroll pretty much, well, he's the majority shareholder now at Aston Martin, whether he'll be willing to let the board put in a different driver or whether they'll wait for Perez to move on, that's where things get a little bit more tricky. And it's one of those teams that I think there's so many question marks. I'm really excited to see where they go with it. And whilst I think the car has a lot of potential to be really, really strong, like McLaren, they're going to have that Mercedes engine, you would imagine. Their road cars have Mercedes engines. The deal's already in place, so I don't think that'll change. And I think they're a team that, for the future, are going to do a hell of a lot of good for Formula One. But I just think that Lance Stroll... and I hate to say it because, I think he gets far too much hate for a driver who has ability. I just think he might hold that team back a little bit, but I would love to be proved wrong. And he's one of those drivers that we saw him get a podium before, and if he can just show that ability that he proves every year in Monza, if he can do that on a more consistent basis, then I would love to say that everything I've just said is a load of nonsense and Stroll's going to be champion. I just think, from my better judgment, that's not quite going to happen. We'll move on to question 4, a slightly shorter one from AH Gaming YT. It's one that I always pretty much talk about, but I don't think I've ever directly answered the question. Do you think Hulkenberg deserves another chance in Formula 1? Yes, I do. Moving on to question 5. No, I think Nico is an awesome driver. In 2018, I've said this many times, in 2018, I really think was in my top 3 drivers of the season. He was so good in 2018. And yesterday in the race rewind for the American Grand Prix, wasn't it? The 20 where Raikkonen won. Hulkenberg was fighting with the Red Bulls in the top 5. I mean, how was a driver who was by far best of the rest? I mean, Sainz was by far best of the rest in 19, but Hulkenberg comfortably beat Sainz in 18, was comfortably better than anyone else in the midfield. How he has lost his drive is criminal. And if he doesn't find his way back to Formula 1, that's even worse. And you can point to the fact he's never got a podium. That's fine. Has he ever really had machinery that should have been able to deliver a podium? I don't really think so. And you can point to Brazil 2012 and say, look, he should have got a podium on that day. Yeah, he probably should. He made contact with Hamilton, he probably should have. Should that Force India have been anywhere near leading that Grand Prix? No, it shouldn't have. You then look at Germany last year, up in P2 in the Renault. Bottled it, like so many did, like Hamilton, Leclerc, Sainz, all did at that runoff section. Should have he been in P2 anyway? Probably not. And again, that's a weak argument because, again, he should have probably scored podiums on those particular days. But if he was a driver who was in a Mercedes for 2 years and hadn't got a podium, then yeah, I'm more than happy to put my hands up and say, look, he probably shouldn't come back if he's taking that long to score a podium in a Mercedes. But he's a driver who I really do believe has proved himself to be one of the best in the midfield. I strongly believe that. And after one down season in 2019, and I certainly didn't think he was the worst driver in 2019, after one bad year to kick him out, I don't really like that. I really do think he's been hard done by Renault, and they wanted to bring in Ocon. I get it, but I also think for teams like Haas, I even spoke about him a little bit in our Ferrari video. If they want a quick fix if Vettel doesn't work in 2020, side note, I think Vettel will be fine. But I think Hulkenberg is a very attractive option. Even if Raikkonen moves on from Alfa Romeo, I think Hulkenberg is a solid driver, and I think he should be on the grid. And I just wanted to put that in words because I've sprinkled around it before in separate videos, but it's on paper now. Well, not really. It's in stone. Whatever. That's my thoughts on Hulkenberg. And we'll move on to our final question before I get any more Hulkenberg haters on me today. Comes from Matthew Slates. This is a bit more in-depth for our audience participation. So if you're new around here, for question 5, every week, I spin it round and throw it back at you guys. And yes, I'll answer the question, but I want to know your thoughts in the comments below. And usually it's something quite straightforward. Best livery, best driver, best circuit, best race of all time. Things like that, you know. But this one caught my eye from Matthew. And Matthew asks, what new rules / procedures could be put into place to prevent 1-2 from dominating Formula 1 for many years, and that would allow multiple teams to regularly compete for podium wins and or the Constructors' Championship? And this is more in depth for our audience participation. I would I may even do a whole video on your answers from this and include you, like I do for the mailbox, and have a big discussion about procedures, because 2022, we all know, is going to be pivotal for Formula 1. I don't think it's been as bad as a lot of people make out in the 2010s. Yes, the last couple of years, Mercedes have won the Constructors comfortably, but only last year they were 1-2 in the standings. Previous years, it was Vettel who was Hamilton's closest challenger. But then we did go for a long time with Hamilton and Rosberg being 1 and 2. And Vettel was always pretty much, when he was at Red Bull, clearly out front there. So we've been in a period of dominance now, you could argue, since 2013. Because 2012, I wouldn't say that was a year Red Bull dominance, and nor 2010, but 2011 was. Rules and regulations is a difficult one. And I like a lot of the things they're changing about 2022. I think, initially off the top of my head, I think changing the chassis to making it more driver affected, in that there's not as much wiggle room for the teams to make crazy innovations, which mechanical and engineering purists probably aren't happy about. But for someone like myself, who's more interested in seeing which drivers are the best and their stories and journeys, that's going to benefit my kind of Formula 1 fan. So I like what they're doing there. A budget cap is something, in theory, I think should work. I think in practicality is something that's going to be so hard to manage, and I think it's going to cause a few more headaches than intended. But the reasoning and thoughts behind it, closing up that deficit between the small teams and the big teams, I think is fantastic. Pit stops, I think, to see more juicy and spicy racing, I think we need shorter tyre life, which is something a little bit left of field. And I don't want to steal all the answers, because again, I think if we can make this a cool community kind of video, that could be quite fun over the next couple of weeks. But I think if we could get a 2-stop minimum, and not necessarily enforcing that, but adding that more variety and spiciness, I guess, is what I would usually say, where we can have a couple of cars on a 1-stop, going really long into the race, and maybe a car doing a 3 or even 4-stop, maybe getting rid of the rule that you've got to have 2 different tyre compounds, but cementing the rule, you've got to do at least 1 stop. Something like that. Because at the moment, pit stops, even when I was growing up, I haven't watched Formula 1 for years and years, but even when I was growing up, pit stops are one of the coolest bits of Formula 1, and I feel we lose a little bit of that magic at the moment. Whether that's refueling or not, I don't think we need that. I don't think that's, yes, it's pretty cool in theory, but I think put it into practice, it's far too dangerous now for Formula 1, and I don't think we need it. I think tyres alone can do the business. It's just at the moment we're so used to 1 stop, 1 stop, 1 stop. Oh, it's a 2-stop weekend. Oh, but there's been a safety car, so it's 1 stop. And I think that could be a small change with big consequences. And I'll leave that there, because again, I think we could make something quite cool out of this, guys. So if you've got some thoughts, throw it in the comments section below. If you've got questions for next week, community post usually comes out a little bit later on, but if you want to ask already, comment section down below, Twitter, Instagram, DM, all that good stuff. Thank you all so much for watching. Subscribe if you're new and you enjoyed today's video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.